welcome to Libraries and Archives Canada. We are gathered here this evening on the traditional, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishnaabe people who have inhabited and cared for these lands long before today. We take this time to show our gratitude and respect them and to the land for all that it provides us. The trees to give shade, water and food to sustain us, and paths to connect us. As a national institution that is part of the federal government, we embrace the responsibility to help ensure that the next generations of land stewards are respectful and grateful for the bounty of this land on which we live, work, and play. We commit to continuing to explore and make meaningful contributions to the calls to action that resulted from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Now, if you read her book, and I just bought my copy, you will know that our author that we're celebrating today is not fond of cursory, formal land acknowledgements. And that's a sentiment, I think, that's shared by many. At LAC, we know that actions speak louder than words, and we strive to accompany our words with concrete initiatives. Bibliothèque et Archives Canada est fière d'associer une fois de plus au Festival international des écrivains d'Ottawa pour présenter cet événement et célébrer le pouvoir de l'écriture. C'est notre deuxième lancement de livre ce mois-ci. I am honored to see you all here today, just a few days before the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, to mark the launch of an eye-opening book. Best-selling Cree author, poet, lawyer, activist Michelle Good once again gifts us with her rich wisdom to pave the way to a better future. With Truth-Telling, 7 Conversations about Indigenous Life in Canada, readers will discover a bold and provocative collection of personal essays exploring contemporary Indigenous experiences in Canada. A natural successor to Michelle Good's debut novel, Five Little Indians, which received many distinctions, including the Governor General's Literary Award for Fiction. Truth-Telling shows an unfiltered version of our history from Indigenous points of view. L'ouvrage met au jour les mythes sur lesquels sont fondées l'histoire canadienne, ainsi que les coups humaines du colonialisme, en plus d'en démontrer les conséquences sur nos institutions. Truth-Telling stresses the importance of Indigenous self-determination, the return of lands, and a just distribution of wealth to achieve meaningful reconciliation. This is food for thought, which is not only essential, but extremely timely. The theme of Indigenous empowerment is especially important to Libraries and Archives Canada. We, in fact, know that it's mandatory to advance progress toward a fairer and inclusive practices in libraries and archives. This is why we at LAC, especially for projects related to their heritage, we prioritize the active involvement of Indigenous nations and communities and Indigenous staff members as critical contributors. Our Indigenous Initiative Division, comprising numerous Indigenous team members, plays a key role in advancing projects such as digitizing documents relating to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation history. En collaboration avec les Premières Nations, les Inuits et la Nation Métis du Canada, nous travaillons aussi à identifier des personnes autochtones sur nos photos d'archives dans le cadre du projet Un visage, un nom, and consultations with members of the Kitigan-Zibi and Algonquin Anishnaabe and the Algonquins of Pikwaktagan First Nation communities have helped shape our new building, whose name is Atisoke, which reflects the Indigenous storytelling traditions, which of course is under construction at 555 Albert Street. This collaborative effort results in a long series of commitments in this partnership. But enough about Libraries and Archives Canada. Today is about the voice of Michelle Good and how we can envision a meaningful step towards substantive reconciliation that includes both words and actions. I can't wait to hear from you, Michelle. During your conversation later this evening with Karen McBride, Algonquin Anishnaabe, and author of Crow Winter, the insight that you provide is essential to help our society acknowledge the past and understand the way forward. With this in mind, I think that we can all agree that we have a lot to learn and to change. But I'm nevertheless very grateful that our current times leave room for us to hear stories that have previously been excluded from the narrative of our collective memories. Le succès exceptionnel que connaît Michelle Good témoigne de l'appétit de lecteur pour la vérité, une vérité sans filtre, essentielle à notre réconciliation. Thank you so much, Michelle Good, for your exceptional work. Merci. Bonne soirée à tout le monde. And just before handing the microphone over to Sean Wilson, I do want to take a moment to mention that tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., we will be doing a film showing of the documentary Honor to Senator Murray Sinclair by director Alanis Obemswan. And it's going to be taken here at the John McCrae Auditorium from 10 a.m. until 11:30. So if any of you happen to be free tomorrow morning, please do come and join us. There is, of course, free admission, and I think the more people that have an opportunity to see this documentary, the more impact that it can have. So I would now like to hand over the microphone to my dear colleague and artistic director of the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Over to you, Sean Wilson.
Thank you, Leslie. It's wonderful to be back at Library and Archives Canada on behalf of the Writers Festival. Thank you all for being here. We're back in this room on Monday. Angela Sterritt will be here in conversation with Erica Iffel. Tuesday, we are just over there at Christchurch Cathedral with Naomi Klein. The following week, Ed Broadbent is here, Kathy Reichs is here, and then the festival actually gets started on October 25th. Please do take a moment to go to the website and see what's there. We're opening with an amazing night, both events hosted by Sheila Rogers. We're concluding with Bob Joseph, 21 Things to Do After the Indian Act, and there is an amazing host of writers from across the country, coast to coast to coast, and from around the world. We've got guests from the States, from Ireland, and from Germany this year that are going to add that international flavor. The one thing that I want to ask of all of us here, I guess, as we talk about truth and reconciliation, is before we use the R word, we're going to start with the truth. And the best thing that I can do as a settler is to educate myself. So I would highly recommend, I know you're all here, so I'm preaching on a certain level to the converted. Thank you. The next step, after you've listened to the conversation, is to go and buy multiple copies of that book. This is my second copy because it's one that I will be lending and giving out to people. Anyone, the bottom line is anyone that pretends not to know the history of this place, any political leader of any political parties that pretends they don't understand this country, the history, you can hand them this book and say you have no excuse not to know the truth and not to speak with truth. At the back of the room, our friends from Perfect Books are there. That's the one other thing I want to do is when you're buying a book, please buy it from an actual bookseller, from a bricks and mortar store that pays a living wage. There are 4 wonderful independent bookstores in this city. There used to be so many more, so they need your support, they need our support. The wonderful people at Perfect Books are at the festival. When you buy a book here, not only are you allowed to get the book signed, and are you allowed to keep it, you actually can take it home. But they also make a donation to our children's literacy program, and thanks to you buying the book, we're able to work with thousands of local children each year and giving them the gift of literacy and self-expression. Again, thank you all so very much for being here. After the conversation, Michelle will be signing books right over there, so don't be shy, get your book signed. And our host this evening is the amazing Karen McBride. And I know Leslie mentioned Pearl Winter, remarkable novel, which I love that. And she always says it's not that, it's a fantastic read. I adored it. I hope you run out and get that as well. And she's also a book designer. So Karen is like, for me, the art she's done on the page in terms of designing book covers, she's a remarkable human being. And I'm just so glad to have these 2 women on stage talking to us about truth. And let's give them a warm welcome. Karen.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello. Just take a second to get comfy here. Right. Kwe, kakakikwe, namarin, shishmigizi Indigenous, Mkwado Dem, Tushmin First Nation Duchuba. Hello, my name is Karen McBride. I am from the Tushmin First Nation, which is in the territory of Western Quebec. I'm of the Bear Clan. That's what I have said in a nutshell. Actually gave you my spirit name. I think it's always important to open these conversations, especially when we're on Anishinaabe territory, with the original language of this place. So it's nice to welcome it in that way. Michelle, I am so excited to be up here with you. We were texting earlier because that's what so friends do. And we were joking about how we have to make sure we don't just spend an hour up here laughing and catching up. We need to try to focus. I'm going to do my best to not get too off topic, or maybe we'll talk about renovations, maybe we'll talk about dogs. It's all part of the truth. This book is phenomenal. I almost read it in one sitting. I told myself to slow down because I wanted to take time and not devour it. Although everyone has their own preferred method of reading a book like this, but I think it's important that we sit and digest these words because it should be the quintessential book. Like if you read one collection of essays ever, especially as a Canadian, it should be truth-telling. On that note, how do you hope this book is received by Indigenous people and also our non-Indigenous communities?
Well, Marty Sinclair said, he basically, I addressed this in the introduction to the book, that he basically established truth as a prerequisite of reconciliation, that we cannot achieve the hallmarks, the milestones of reconciliation if we don't agree on the truth of the history of this country. And, I refer to this an awful lot in the book as well as in my life, but we are struggling to overcome the myth of Canadian history. We need to get under the myth of Canadian history and to begin to understand history as it was experienced in this country through an Indigenous lens. As Indigenous people experienced our history as it was unfolding. And if we can't get to that point, we will not achieve reconciliation, because how can we? We're dealing with opposing conceptions of the nature of our history and the impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples in Canada. So my hope is that the book will inspire people to question what they think they know, question the bill of goods you've been sold, and reconsider what you think you know, and re-educate yourself. take a step in the direction of understanding our history through the lens of Indigenous experience. So that's my big hope.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell, yeah.
You open the book with an epigraph by the incomparable John Trudell. How does this epigraph in particular inform your approach to writing in the time of reconciliation?
Mhm. Well, I'll go there and I'll share that with you for those of you who don't have it in front of you. And for those of you who don't know who John Trudell was, he was an American Indian movement activist who played a key role in some critical events in Indigenous history in North America, the takeover of Alcatraz Island. I see lots of silver hairs in the room, folks who might remember that. The walk of broken treaties to Washington, various critical demonstrations leading up to Wounded Knee and those kinds of events. John was a poet, an activist, just a wonderful human being. And he said this, among many things: when one lives in a society where people can no longer rely on the institutions to tell them the truth must come from culture and art. And that's what I see so many Indigenous writers doing in their work, be it fiction, nonfiction, poetry, is, as my overworn analogy of getting under that pen and speaking truths that have not really been permitted until very recently. After I wrote the book, and after the book was actually published, I came across another quotation about truth by from an unusual source in this context. It was Anais Nin, who said, "When they asked me for the truth, I believe they were asking me for a version they could live with." And that's what we've been taught. That is what we as Canadians have been subjected to, so that we could live with that history and not face the truth of the brutality and the violence of colonialism, and how that continues to be infused in our institutions and continues to be a challenge in our daily lives as Indigenous people.
So, and also, if anyone has seen Smoke Signals, if you don't know who John Trudell is, he is the radio host.
It's a good day to be Indigenous.
Yes.
He's that guy.
That
in
iconic.
Smoke Signals.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So the book is separated into 7 essays. 7 is a very important number for a lot of Indigenous folk. In my culture, in the Anishnaabe belief, we have 7 grandfather teachings that kind of guide us to live the good life. Was this a intentional choice or a happy accident?
It was, because in my Cree traditions, we also have 7 teachings. Mm-hmm. And I didn't sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write 7 essays. But as I began outlining it, it was like, oh, 7 essays. So I just sort of went with it. And so I did that. Yeah.
I love those little
moments.
Exactly. Yeah, little guiding moments, right? Not trickster moments, which are less. How some of the most of the bulk of the book is very can be very hard heavy. How did you protect yourself while you were writing this?
Well, I thought about this book. Well, I thought about the essays for 8 months, and I wrote the book in 4. So I think that approach was, these essays were writing themselves in my head, and that thinking time about it was infuriating, frustrating, and I was having a hard time getting to the point of putting words on a page, and I was thinking, why? I know what I want to say, and I came up with it, and it was because I've been saying this my whole damn life, right? Must I continue? How much do we have to communicate this in order for us to not have to say it anymore? for us not to have to revisit the horrors of, our colonial history anymore, and just have it as a mutual understanding in our country, and proceed from there. So I think that was my real issue. But then they just flowed from there, and it went quite smoothly after that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And they read so wonderfully one after another. I promise I won't just be up here like telling you how good it is the whole time, but it is really good. If you have not read it yet, please do that as soon as you're done here. In Lucy and the Football, fantastic title, wonderful way to frame that particular discussion. You mentioned that reconciliation is not a checklist that can be discussed over tea. It's not achievable in an afternoon, yet often Canadians want a soundbite answer or instructions, especially this week as we lead into September 30th. We get lots of, how can I help? What can I do? And there's sort of like an onus often put on Indigenous people to, again, do the work and summarize and do that. So how do you suggest we respond to these people? How do we help them help themselves?
These poor people. Well, one of the things that I say all the time is be courageous enough to question what you think you know. Because it's not your fault. I mean, it's the bill of goods that we've been sold right from first contact about what the nature of the relationship is and what the truth is of our history. And so, there is so much work now that has been done, so much work in fiction, nonfiction, poetry, academic work, just tremendous amounts of work that have been done, that if anybody wants to get to the truth, they can. But it's a commitment that people have to make of their time, of people being willing to step away from their preconceptions and stereotypical thinking. It takes a commitment. And, I didn't say this at the beginning, but I'll say it now. And I usually begin things like this with that, is that I appreciate this opportunity. I appreciate being able to be here with you tonight and to have these conversations, because reconciliation is not going to happen through legislation. It's not going to happen on the floor of the House of Commons. It's going to happen in these conversations as we change hearts and minds, and as the privileged of the country stand up and insist on a new relationship, insist that those relationships be infused with the truth of our historical experiences and our current experiences in this country. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that really stood out for me, particularly in the Racism Carefully Zone, was how you described the transmission of these racist beliefs. That it's almost like a weaponized version of storytelling. Because
Excellent.
right,
I remember that.
you take it, yeah, it's all yours. Traditionally, we use our oral history, our storytelling to tell truths, and the way that that racism is learned is kind of done in a way that's passed down and inherited.
Well, and that came to me when I was doing research. I was going to do a master's in law, and I came to my senses. And this was a long time ago. This was in 2000, and that was when you had to actually go to the dusty archives, right? You couldn't find all this stuff online like you can now. And I was reading about these hideous people like Langdon and Heater Reed and what's his name, Dallin, who were the fathers of Confederation and the proponents of the residential school system. And it just came to me one day. I thought, what did their children learn at their meeting? Because we all know that children learn through observational learning. It's like osmosis. This is how intergenerational trauma works as well. You observe your parent who is a residential school survivor, and you observe their trauma responses to the world, and you absorb those as this is how you relate to the world. That's one aspect of intergenerational trauma. I'll talk about another aspect of it later. But it's not just Indigenous people. It's not just Indigenous children that learn that way through observing, listening, being immersed in that. And so I thought about these people who were, saying the most hideous things, like Sir John A. Macdonald, who was promoting these residential schools and said, when the school is on the reserve, I'm actually going to read it because it's worth it, so just give me a second. My trusty little bag of tricks. Okay. Yes, this was a statement of his to the House of Commons. He was not the Prime Minister just yet. He was the head of the Indian Affairs Department. And so he said, when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with the parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself, as the head of the department, that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. So what did his kids learn at his knee? What did his kids listen to around the dinner table? Duncan Campbell's thought. What did his children, I don't know if he had children, but you get my point. What did they learn and absorb? And for those of you who haven't read the book yet, the essay that Karen is referring to, Racism Carefully Sown, is about my grandmother and how she reacted when my father, who was French and English, came home and said he was going to marry my grandmother. She hit the roof. She said he would be disowned, disinherited. She took to her bed for 3 days. And, and my mother was a celebrity at the time. This was a time in the 40s when we still had to get passes to leave the reserve. And my mother, determined to get an education, ended up in New Zealand training as a midwife and a nurse. And that was something she couldn't do in Canada because Indigenous people were not permitted to get an education at that time beyond grade 9. And so here is my mother, this amazing woman who was at one point presented to Princess Alice, right, the mother of the previous Duke of Edinburgh, but she's not good enough because she's Cree, because she's not white. And so, the question that I pose in that essay is, was my grandmother a monster? And the answer to that is no, of course not. She wasn't a monster, just like nobody really is a monster except for the monsters, right? She was a prairie woman of her day. That is the conception of Indigenous people that had been perpetrated over and over and over and over again. And one thing that I also mentioned in that essay is, my dad said, too bad I'm married her. So, and I'm glad, here I am, right? And, but after the wedding and, some time later, my mother was expecting her first child, my older sister. And so my grandmother invited her to join her and a few of her friends. They were having tea. And she introduced my mother and she said, this is Martha, she's having puppies. Okay, now imagine that. Imagine little children observing Indigenous people being treated that way. And the impact that has, because those children grew to be prime ministers and ministers and government officials and teachers, right? That's who, those little children hearing those hideous things are the people who occupy powers and positions of power in this country and have for hundreds of years. But I can look back to working as an activist in the 70s, and the things that we see now in terms of land acknowledgements, in terms of having a room full of people like this, coming to listen to the things that I have to say, would simply have never happened. It would have never, ever happened. So it would be untruthful to say that there hasn't been significant progress, but we are still under the thumb of what is ultimately a colonial system. And until that changes, and the spirit of treaty, and the spirit of those first relationships becomes manifest in a modern way, we will not have reconciliation. We simply will not.
I was like, I'm gonna hold for applause, it's gonna happen. So on this same note, here's a fun question. Why can't they just get over it?
Oh dear God.
Yeah, we think we should unpack that. I can ask that because she likes speaking, so.
Yeah, that was actually the motivation for writing Five Little Indians, was when I first started writing the novel, I was still practicing law and representing residential school survivors. And I would spend my days, every day, because that's what I did exclusively, was I represented and advocated for survivors. And I would spend every single day listening to some of the most horrendous things that you can imagine that were done to little children. And then I would go home and I'd read a newspaper article or a comment on a newspaper piece, and somebody would be saying, why can't they just get over it? And I would just become so enraged by it. Like, what are you, stupid? I mean, it's like, seriously, would you say that to a survivor of the camps in the Second World War? No, of course not. And so that's why I wrote Five Little Indians, was to answer that question. You want to know why? This is why. This is why, because trauma has a half-life. It carries on and on and on until there is an appropriate response, a recognition of the place that we legitimately should hold in this society. And that's, to me, is the objective of reconciliation, is to restore the relationships that were intended by treaty. I'm a treaty person, so I see things through that lens. And I talked about that a little bit today in another event I did in Montreal. I was in Montreal this morning. Is when we think about the treaty discussions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and we see the language of the treaties that include terms like surrender, that the lands will be surrendered. We didn't conceptualize ownership of land. It was beyond our conception that you could own land, because we are born with a responsibility to the land. And so how can you imagine what surrendering land would mean if you can't conceive of owning it in the first place? And so the intention from the Indigenous perspective, and my great-grandmother, her uncle was Stanimaswa, Big Bear, who held out as long as he possibly could before taking Treaty 6. And now I lost my train of thought. The conception, as I understand it, was that we would agree to share, right? That we would agree to coexist, that the settler people could be here and we'd be here. We'll do what we're doing, you do what you're doing. And when you think about, I like to use the Turo Wampum Belt. It's a treaty between the Dutch and Iroquois, and the Haudenosaunee. And when the Dutch were first coming to North America, the Indigenous people noticed that there were these unusual people kicking around. And so they went and met with them, and they discussed exactly that. What will our relationships be with each other? And for those of you, how many people have seen an image of the two-row waffle? Some, okay. So it's a belt, it's a beaded belt made of diptalia, and there's 2 purple rows, and they're bound in white in 3 other white rows. And they're meant to symbolize 2 canoes going down the river, and never the twain shall meet. We go our way, you go your way. And that was the intention, not only behind that treaty, and it was a treaty, and that treaty was renewed in 1763, I think, in this area, bringing in other Indigenous groups as well. So it was to coexist. It wasn't to be dominated, to be controlled, and to be annihilated. It was we welcomed folks here. And I often think about it, if we had received even 1% of the wealth that has been taken from this country, imagine how different things would be. Imagine, would we have a tainted drinking water problem? Would we have absolutely untenable housing conditions? No. And, we were overpowered by the power of colonialism, and rather than being honorable and just to the terms of the treaty, it just took everything.
That's it for a second. Digest it. Like I said when I was talking about how you read the book, I think you should always have them as a digest.
It's interesting that you say that, because when the book was just about to be released, and CBC wanted to do an interview, and I sort of went, because there's a period of time from the time you finish the book and the time the book is released, right? And so I thought, what did I say? I was like, what did I write? Oh, so I sat down and I read it all in one sitting, like in one day. And doing that, okay, this is a good point, but I felt that there was it gave it even more strength to read it one right after the other, and to read it in one sitting. So I encourage people to try one or the other, right? It was,
do both?
Yeah, or both, yes. Yeah.
You talk about how originally the idea was that we would share our resources, our space, our land, and with these colonizers that came over, it reminds me of the chapter, fiction just says my brain, the essay Cultural Pillagers, and the way that you describe or use the metaphor of different plant species,
Yes.
and how that works with identity and claiming false identity, and that fun phenomenon that we're dealing with right now.
It's just stunning, right?
Yes.
For those of you that haven't read the book, Cultural Pillagers is about Pretendians, about people who try to pass themselves off as Indigenous. And the first thing that I always think about in that is, this is a fairly recent, aside from, what's his name, Grey Owl, it's a fairly recent phenomenon of people doing these things. And they weren't doing them in the 70s, and I'll tell you why, because it was too damn hard to be an Indigenous person in the 70s. Nobody wanted to be Indigenous in the 70s. It was brutal. But once it came to have a certain cachet, or there was a lot of money involved, like we see with this professor out of the University of Saskatchewan, and Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, and so on, suddenly you have all of these people that are claiming to be Indigenous, and not just individuals, whole groups of people. There's massive litigation going on in Ontario right now, where there are groups of people who have incorporated themselves as an Indigenous, as an Indian man. How that's even possible, I don't know. They've lost all their court cases so far, so let's hope that continues. But I was trying to conceive of how do you explain this? And in Primal Indians, for those of you who have read that, there's a passage where Clara is contemplating something that was said to her by one of her close friends and teachers, and told her that she was not a weed, that she was an Indigenous flower. And so I thought, let's extend that, let's expand that concept. And so then the next step, of course, is what is an Indigenous plant? And so I just love this so much. So I start Googling away, like, what is an Indigenous plant? And what is the name of the society? It's just slipped my aging mind. We'll look it up because it's worth it.
It's one of those many flags.
But yeah, it's, fix it. Sorry about this. Oh, who does all the, oh, anyway, you look it up for me while I collaborate. So, but the definition of an Indigenous plant, it's hilarious, right? An Indigenous plant is a plant that existed in North America prior to European colonization. In other words, us, right? Indigenous people. Okay, so then, thank you. Okay. Where's the name of the thing?
Pillaging Society.
Where is it? You didn't find it.
I did.
Where? Oh, yes. Thank you. I'm getting so old, it's shameful. The Audubon Society. Okay, so it's the Audubon Society that comes up with this. Scientifically speaking, native plants are species that existed historically in an area. The Audubon Society's Plants for Bird programs deliberately states that native plants are those that have existed in a location prior to European colonization of North America. And so by analogy, I'm saying that's who we are, the Indigenous people. We are those, the native plants. And then they go into the definition of a naturalized plant. And a naturalized plant is a plant that wasn't here, but the environment has accepted it. And it's able to grow without being destructive, okay? And so that's what I refer to people, non-Indigenous people who have been adopted into an Indigenous community and accepted, and they take a place in the family system and, you know, sometimes clan systems and so on. So the adopted people are the naturalized plants, and then there is the invasive species. Invasive plants are non-native to particular ecosystems, and their introduction is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health, according to the National Invasive Species Information Center. These are the plant equivalents to these identity frauds, right? And, you know, because it becomes very complex when these people are, you know, like Mary Ellen Turpel-Fond, right? Who is married into an Indigenous community. But that doesn't make her Indigenous. And she's been accepted in that community. It doesn't make her Indigenous. And it seems ridiculous to me that I have to come up with an analogy like that to tell people she's not Indigenous, right? But yeah, and, you know, and it's so horrifying because, you know, basically anybody with a PhD can walk into a university and say, yeah, I'm Métis and I really suffered, had a hard life, hire me. And they take the place of genuinely Indigenous people in the academy, in corporation. Joseph Boyd, you know, his sister is a consultant, is an Indigenous consultant to a corporation in the oil patch. How can she represent us? You know, it's something, and the Gill sisters, who you may have heard of, who claim to be Inuit and received all kinds of funding for their education, and one of them was going to law school. I thought, oh my God, they're now being charged under the criminal code, under the fraud provisions of the criminal code, which is what I argued was possible in the Mary Ellen Turpel Fontes as well. She, she lied her way into a judgeship, right? Because they were looking to appoint an Indigenous judge. And it's, and it's so ironic, right? Because I think anybody that wants to fake being Indigenous should be forced to live in grassy narrows and to drink the mercury poisoned water, to watch their babies suffering from, chronic skin conditions because of the water. Go in there, claim your indigeneity there. It wouldn't last a day. But here we are.
People let them double down and aren't like, okay, you caught me.
Oh, God, no. Yeah. I know. Who was that person? Who was that person? From Saskatchewan, the professor, Carrie Bourassa. Yeah, and that's what she did. That, she was caught out, and she just said no. And then it ultimately came down to her saying, well, I conceive of myself that way. And I'm Chinese. Yeah. So, but anyway, yeah. I'm so happy to find that Ottawa thing. I'm dancing around my house.
I know, it's perfect, right?
It's perfect.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I just keep like the naturalized. I love it. Yeah, so I have
It's the best analogy that I've ever experienced. Yeah.
see nature looking out for us.
There you go.
Exactly. One of the many amazing points that you bring up in the essay collection is Gerald Weisner's use of the term survivance. I thought that was beautiful. From Jeffrey's book, survivance is to survival what dominance is to dominant. It goes beyond the singular incident, the moment frozen in time, and reflects a state of being that encompasses everything we continue to be following the moment of survival. Indigenous peoples have not just simply survived, we continue to breathe life into our cultures in fluid, critical, and generative ways. So how do you see this survivance represented today in arts, literature, education?
Well, I like to think of culture and language when I think about survivance. But just stepping back a little bit, when we talk about survival and we talk about survivors, we create this image of people hanging on by their fingernails or the skin of their teeth. That's not us. We're thriving. We are thriving in every way. Yes, we have all sorts of issues, but we are thriving. And we continue, in spite of all of these profound efforts to be done with us. And when we think of language and culture, language in particular, I worked with an organization, a curriculum development, well, it was at that time a curriculum development project, and it became an Indigenous post-secondary institution. And they were working on creating a dictionary for the Indigenous language and that location in British Columbia. And they were faced with the reality of, how do you say computer? How do you say refrigerator? How do you say spaceship? How do you say those things in an ancient language? And it called on the creativity of those people that were working on it to come up with those things, but the language continues to be a living language because of that. And so the word for computer in that language is intelligent machine, right? In the language, right? And and that is representative of that, yes, we are in a state of survivance, which means we continue to thrive, grow, expand. We are not a dead culture. We are not, an extinct culture that is just performative in nature. We have cultures that continue to grow and adapt to our circumstances.
It makes me think of how can we still be hopeful when you bring up and say, how can I not be?
Well, and then somebody asked me that, and it really made me think. Sometimes I just get downright furious about it all, But if you believe that something is possible, then it behooves you to be hopeful. You have to be hopeful if you believe that the outcome that you're looking for is possible. And so that's what keeps me hopeful, is reminding myself that I believe it's possible. I've spent my whole life believing that it's possible. And so, when people respond to me with, in my own circle, with despair and disappointment, I try to remind them of that. And, hope fuels us. In my conversation I had this morning with this corporation in Montreal, someone said, what about hope? Sometimes I feel hope, but sometimes I feel rage. What's the relationship? And I said, well, they inspire you one way or another. They each have their role in this work that we do.
Absolutely. Do we have time for questions? What do you think? Yes. So I would like to invite any audience member who has a question. I think we have some time for it, and Michelle will be happy to hear your question. Okay.
I'd like to thank you both for a most interesting conversation indeed. And I understand the passion that you have about these people who are claiming identities that doesn't belong to them. And I understand that, but I want to suggest to you that your analogy is even better than you suggested in applying it to them. That in fact it makes a lot of sense for us who are here to aspire to be naturalized plants and to recognize that there is a new place of living together and living in a way that doesn't intrude and diminish and that the invasive species, the zebra mussels, is the settler mentality that has dominated the last 250 years.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, don't be shy. Who's going to answer the question? Your mom was right.
I know for sure.
Sorry, Karen. Hi, my name is Shirley Cagliosi, and I'm from Algonquin Anishnaabe First Nation. Well, that's where I'm registered. I wasn't raised there, but I just came back from doing what is called the Grand River Water Walk, which is an Indigenous Life ceremony. And there were places that we would walk through where non-Indigenous people would actually walk behind us. And they say, we believe in what you're doing. And then you get other people who would look at us and go, you can't be doing this. Get off the road. Mm-hmm. And there were people, and yet there were other people that every time they saw a car with their hazard lights on, would just honk their horn. And it just kind of made you say, they know what we're doing. And I understand, like, I got both books today, by the way. I know it's going to be difficult for me to read both of them, especially I understand this one is going to be painful for me to read. But I endeavor to read both of them, and I thank you. I thank you both for being here. Thank you, Miigwech.
Yeah, thank you. And a lot of people talk to me about being trepidatious about reading Five of Indians. And for those of you that have read it, I think you'll agree that it's not a trauma fest. There's humor and joy and hope and all sorts of good stuff in there. And so, don't worry. I think you'll like it.
I love humor.
It's a beautiful book. I was lucky enough to be asked
She's
to
learned
make
quite a
it
lot.
learn it, so I got to read ahead of everybody else. And, it's a stunning piece of work, so it's really, it's just everything you want it to be.
Hi, my name is Knabe. I am German, and I've lived in Canada now for almost 40 years. And I came for 3 weeks, by the way. But that's a long time ago. I just wanted to, I was born right at the end of World War II, on the day that Berlin fell. So I'm on that generation that first we were not told anything. And my father never came back from the war. I got his name because they didn't think of another name for me, which is fine eventually. But we had to learn really by searching sources because our teacher said I was too involved, I don't want to talk about it. That was a typical answer. So we had to learn a lot bit about it, but it meant that we actually did learn, and eventually the German society really took a major step forward in acknowledging, finding the truth, admitting the truth, whether it was their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, or whatever. And really the generation learned quite a lot. Second generation really learned a lot. Maybe now there's sort of, it's history, don't have to deal with it anymore now. And it comes in waves. So when I came to Canada, I was quite shocked how little there was known, and I'd actually ended up searching for information about what I had heard, because the German idea of Indian and settlers, so to say. Well, we always wanted to play Indian, we never wanted to play anybody else.
And still today.
Still today, yeah. And so I just compared in a way of what we went through as a society. The whole German society was up, certainly in Western Germany, now East Germany as well. But at the time they thought they had nothing to do with it because they were not part of the inheritance. And so I compare what we went through, and I think the society here, we all have to help to get more people to read books like yours, and I read Found in Indian when it first came out, and read it more than once actually, and so this one is on my list for the second reading now as well. But it's interesting for me to compare it, but I can also see that how much you can learn also from other countries, how they dealt with their trauma and with their disastrous history. And we can all learn from that, and we can all get to a better place.
Thank you. It inspired me to just say a little something about a little something. In 1907, there was a study commissioned by the Department of Indian Affairs in response to the overwhelming concerns of parents of kids in res school. So they sent my hero, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, to do a study of the conditions of residential schools. And he came back and he said this. He said, Indian boys and girls are dying like flies. Even war seldom shows as large a percentage of fatalities as the education system we have imposed on our Indian wards. Duncan Campbell Scott, then the superintendent of Indian Affairs, fired Dr. Bryce as a result. But he also responded by saying this: it is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness, habituating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. It is quite within the mark to say that 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education which they had received therein. How many people would have imagined that the term final solution originated here? Okay, this was well before the Second World War. And Think about that.
National crime, indeed.
Yes, indeed.
Just a personal question, Michelle.
Uh-oh.
In your early 40s,
Yeah.
you had the strength and faith in yourself to completely pivot and start law school and become a lawyer.
Mhm.
And then 20 years later, you had the strength and faith in yourself to pivot again and become a best-selling author. So I have two questions. One, where did that strength come from to make such dramatic changes in your life? When a lot of people think that, they've kind of done all they can do. And the second question is, what's your next act?
I think I'll become a painter. Unfortunately, my great visual mind doesn't translate through my fingers. But it's nice to see you. And I don't know, I think my mother's story had a profound impact on me. She was in a residential school. She observed her best friend, who is represented as Lily in 5 Olympians, hemorrhaged to death on the playground of her residential school. She fought to be able to attend a public school. Her first week in school, she was diagnosed with TB, and then she had contracted at the res school and was in a TB sanatorium for 3 years, where she spent every minute of her time writing letters saying, I want an education, I want an education, and she made it happen. And I think she was a phenomenal role model for me. So I think that, but also just sort of a fundamental and very natural stubbornness. I refuse to be defeated. And, I was a 60 scoop kid had nothing to do with my family, why I was apprehended. But there was just no way that I was going to allow myself to be defeated. The idea, and it's interesting because people ask me that, what was it like to go from activist to lawyer to author? And it's all the same work, it's just a different approach. And that's how I experience it and how I see it. It's what I've always been doing. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, we're having an aside.
Yeah,
We're good now. I think so, unless there are any more burning questions.
Last chance, going once, twice. Thank you so much.